This is Angular's default approach to security. Pretty straightforward. The answer to the question, does Angular trust this value, is no. Angular goes a step beyond just distrusting values from the user. Rather than try to blacklist all of the things it distrusts, Angular simply whitelists the small number of things it does trust, none of which are values. The things Angular trusts are your template HTML, binding expressions, and attributes. That's it. But what does it mean to say that Angular doesn't trust something? Basically, it means that it's going to sanitize or cleanse any content it doesn't trust before adding it to the DOM. Sanitizing is the process of altering the content so that it's not executable. It doesn't change what's displayed, it just, for example, encodes it so that it isn't executed by the browser. As an example, a piece of HTML content which contains a script tag is going to be converted to a string and added to the DOM that way. It still shows on screen correctly, but the browser doesn't parse, interpret, and execute the content as a script tag. The thing about this, though, is that sanitizing each potential attack vector means different things. A string that's dangerous in HTML might be harmless in a URL, or vice versa. Because of that, Angular takes the context of the content, where it's being added to the DOM, into account when it sanitizes things. For example, the HTML shown here is going to be treated differently depending on whether you're binding it or interpolating. We'll see more on that in just a moment. There are 4 distinct contexts Angular uses to sanitize content: HTML, URL, styles, and resource URLs. This is important to know because when we get to the point where we're overriding the sanitization process, we need to do it specifically for each relevant context. So let's take a quick look at where each context comes into play. First up is the HTML context. This is going to be used for any content bound to the inner HTML property of a DOM element. When in dev mode, Angular is going to put a message in the console whenever it sanitizes some bound HTML. In this context, making the bound value safe entails wrapping it in opening and closing quotes, so the browser treats it as a simple string to be displayed instead of markup to be interpreted. The URL context is going to be used when binding to a URL property such as href. Like the HTML sanitizer, when in dev mode, Angular puts a message in the console whenever it sanitizes a URL. It's interesting how Angular sanitizes the URL value. It actually does it in this case by prefixing the bound value with the word unsafe, which causes the browser to do nothing with the rest of the text. Style is applied when binding to the style property. Like the previous 2 contexts, Angular will let us know when it has sanitized a style binding when we're in dev mode. For this context, Angular sanitizes the bound value by just dropping it. And the resource URL context is for either binding to a script source or including the script source in the tag. Here's the thing though, resource URL is the only context which is not sanitized per se. Instead, the whole tag is just dropped. This makes sense because the script loaded by this property is going to contain code, which is always going to be different. There's no way for Angular to reliably clean up any old arbitrary code. Like I said, in this case, the entire script tag is just not added to the DOM. There's one final quasi-context, which is any value being interpolated. Content inside those double curly braces is always sanitized. Any HTML in the content added to the DOM via interpolation is made safe, so the browser processes it as a string, note the added open and close quotes, and therefore the script tag is displayed, but not processed as a script tag. So the code inside it or the script referenced by it is not run or loaded. In the UI, we still see this as literal text. Note that the interpolated HTML is treated slightly differently from bound HTML. Interpolated is treated as shown here, where you see the script tag, but in bound HTML, the offending script tag is actually removed, so all you see is the content.